My name is Caleb, and for most of my life I was the son my family forgot to mention. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way people write about in books where the parents are monsters and the house is cold. It was quieter than that, more like standing in a room full of people who are laughing at a joke you weren't told. And after a while, you stop waiting to be included and you just leave. My brother, older by 4 years, was the one they talked about at the dinner table. My brother got the scholarships. My brother made the right friends. My brother married the right woman. And when my brother's wife, Dana, decided she didn't like me, which happened roughly 6 months after they started dating, my family rearranged themselves around that preference the way furniture gets moved to make space for something new. I don't think they even noticed they were doing it. I noticed. I was 19 the first time my mom called to tell me about a family event after it had already happened. A birthday dinner for my dad. She said it slipped her mind. I said okay. I drove back to my apartment and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I went inside. By the time I was 25, I had built something of a life that had nothing to do with any of them. I finished law school. I passed the bar on my first attempt. I took a position at a mid-size firm in the city. Not flashy, not the kind of place that gets written up in magazines, but serious work. Litigation, the kind where you sit across from people who think they're untouchable, and you spend months finding the one thread that unravels everything. My family didn't know any of this, not really. My mom knew I was doing something with law. My dad thought I worked for the government. My brother had never asked. And Dana had made it very clear years ago that what I did with my life was not something she intended to spend energy on. That was fine. By 25, I had stopped needing them to understand me. I just hadn't stopped loving them, which was the part that kept causing problems. The invitation to Christmas that year didn't come to me directly. I found out about it because my cousin texted me a photo from the family group chat, one I had apparently been removed from at some point without anyone saying anything, asking if I'd seen the hilarious thing Uncle Roy said. I hadn't seen it. I wasn't in the chat. My cousin assumed it was a technical glitch. I knew it wasn't. I texted my mom, asked if there was a Christmas gathering being planned. She took 11 hours to respond, which told me everything before the message even came through. When it did, she said yes. There was a dinner at my brother's house, and that it might be better if I didn't come this year. She said Dana had been stressed. She said it wasn't personal. She said she hoped I understood. I read that message 3 times. Then I put my phone face down on my desk and went back to the file I'd been reviewing. That file was the thing that changed everything. But I didn't know it yet. Let me explain what I do. At my firm, I specialize in civil litigation, but in recent years I'd moved more toward cases involving financial misconduct, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. The cases where someone in a position of trust quietly helped themselves to things that didn't belong to them. I was good at it not because I was smarter than anyone else, but because I was patient. I could read through 1,000 pages of documents and spot the moment where the story stopped making sense. A few days after my mom's text, my supervising partner dropped a new matter on my desk, a referral from another firm. Corporate client. They suspected someone connected to a real estate investment group had been misrepresenting assets in a private lending arrangement. They needed someone to review the documentation and assess whether there was a viable claim. I took the file home that night. I was 3 pages into the introductory documents when I stopped reading. I turned back to the first page. Read the name of the individual at the center of the alleged misconduct. The name was Ryan Mercer. Ryan Mercer was my brother's name. Not a common combination. But I told myself it was a coincidence. My brother was in sales, medical device sales. He'd been doing it for years. He didn't have anything to do with real estate investment groups or private lending. I kept reading. The address listed for the individual was in the same suburb where my brother and Dana had bought their house 3 years ago. I put the file down. I got a glass of water. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the street below for a long time. Then I went back to the table and kept reading, because that is the only thing I know how to do when something is difficult. You keep reading. By midnight, I had read enough to know that the Ryan Mercer in this file and my brother Ryan Mercer were almost certainly the same person. The short version of what I found, the version that leaves out the hundreds of pages of supporting documentation, is this. My brother had been acting as an intermediary between a small private investment group and a series of real estate deals. The investors believed they were funding residential property acquisitions that would be flipped for profit. What they were actually funding was less clear. What was clear was that the financial reports my brother had been providing them didn't match the actual records. Numbers had been adjusted, properties had been overvalued. One property listed as an active asset in investor reports had been sold 18 months earlier. The money from that sale had gone somewhere, but not back to the investors. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had constructed this carefully. Whether my brother was the architect or a participant, I couldn't tell yet. But his name was on enough of it that the distinction might not matter much legally. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I went to my partner and I disclosed the conflict of interest immediately. I told him the individual named in the file appeared to be my brother. I told him I couldn't work the case. He thanked me for telling him, reassigned it to another attorney in the firm, and told me I'd done the right thing. I had done the right thing. I knew that. It didn't make the drive home that evening any easier. Here is what I did not do. I did not call my brother. I did not call my mom. I did not warn anyone. Not because I wanted Ryan to suffer, but because I had learned enough about these situations to know that the moment you tip someone off, the evidence starts disappearing. Documents get shredded, accounts get moved. Suddenly, everyone has a very convenient explanation for everything. If there were innocent people, and there were, the investors were real people who had put real money in, they deserved to have their case handled properly. My feelings about my family didn't get to override that. I told myself that repeatedly over the following weeks while another attorney worked a file and I worked other cases and tried to pretend I wasn't thinking about it constantly. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, about 6 weeks after I'd recused myself. It wasn't from my family. It was from our firm's receptionist, telling me there was someone in the lobby asking to see me. No appointment. He said he was a family friend and that it was urgent. I almost didn't go down. I had a brief due the next morning and I was behind, but something made me save my document, straighten my jacket, and take the elevator. Standing in the lobby, turning a phone over and over in his hands, was my brother. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him. He lost weight in his face. There were circles under his eyes that hadn't been there at Thanksgiving, not that I would know from Thanksgiving. He was wearing a good coat, the expensive kind, but it looked like he'd slept in it. He saw me come through the door from the elevator bank and something moved across his face that I can only describe as the particular expression of a person who has just realized that the room they walked into is much larger and more serious than they expected. He had known I was a lawyer. He had not known or had not bothered to find out where I worked. I watched him look at the firm's name on the wall behind the reception desk. I watched him look back at me. I watched him put together whatever he was putting together in that moment. I said, "Ryan." He said, "You work here?" I said, "Yes." He said, "This is the firm that," and then he stopped. I said, "Come sit down." We sat in a corner of the lobby near the windows. He kept his coat on. I sat with my hands folded on my knees and waited. Because in my line of work you learn that the most important thing you can do sometimes is simply wait and let the other person fill the silence. He said he was in trouble. I said I knew. He asked how much I knew. I told him honestly, I had seen the file before I recused myself, which means I had seen enough to understand the shape of the problem, but I was no longer involved in the case and couldn't discuss it in any professional capacity. He asked me what recused meant. I explained it. He looked out the window for a long time. Then he said, "Dana doesn't know how bad it is." I said, "Okay." He said it had started small. A contact of his in the real estate space had brought him in as a go-between because Ryan knew people with money, high earners, the kind of people who wanted private investment opportunities that weren't available through traditional channels. Ryan made introductions. He got a finder's fee. It seemed clean. Then the contact started asking him to do more, review documents, sign off on valuations, pass along reports that Ryan didn't fully understand but that his contact assured him were accurate. And Ryan, who was smart about a lot of things but not about when to ask questions, had kept signing and passing and collecting his fees because the money was very good and he had a mortgage, and Dana had tastes that were also very good, and it had been easier to keep going than to stop and look closely at what he was actually participating in. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, I said, "You need an attorney, Ryan. You need one today, not tomorrow." He said, "I came to you." I said, "I can't represent you. I have a conflict of interest that's already been disclosed to my firm. If I tried to advise you on this matter in any real way, I'd be violating professional ethics rules, and I'd also be putting myself at risk of getting pulled into the case. You need someone with no connection to any of this." He looked at me like I'd told him the building was on fire and refused to show him the exit. I said, "I can give you 3 names, good attorneys, people who handle exactly this kind of thing. But you have to call today. Do you understand me?" He said yes. I took up my phone and sent him 3 names with contact information. Then I said, "Is Dana safe? Are you and Dana physically okay?" He said yes, it wasn't like that. I said okay. He said yes, it wasn't like that. I said okay. He said, "Mom said you were upset about Christmas." I looked at him. He said, "She said you made things difficult." I said, "Ryan, call those attorneys." I stood up, shook his hand, and went back to the elevator. I had a brief due in the morning. I went upstairs and finished it. What happened over the following months is not entirely my story to tell, because parts of it belong to the investors and to the legal process and to whatever Ryan and the attorneys he hired worked out between themselves. What I can tell you is that the case did not disappear. The firm continued working it. My brother cooperated fully, which his attorney apparently made clear from the beginning was his only viable path. The contact who had drawn him in, the one who had actually designed the scheme, who had knowingly falsified documents and directed the misrepresentation, faced significantly more serious consequences. Ryan faced consequences too. They were not nothing, but they were not the worst possible outcome. He cooperated, and cooperation matters. The investors got most of their money back. That mattered most. I found out about the Christmas dinner not from my family, but from the same cousin who had texted me the photo back in November. She called me in early December and said she'd heard some things and she was worried about me and she wanted to know if I was okay. I told her I was fine and asked how she was. She said the dinner was still on at my brother's house, but that things felt strange. She said Dana had been very quiet lately. I spent Christmas with a friend from law school and his family in Connecticut. We ate too much and watched a terrible movie, and it was one of the better Christmases I can remember. In January, my mom called me. Not a text, a call, which she almost never made. I was walking from the parking garage to my office building, and I stopped on the sidewalk in the cold and answered it. She said she wanted to explain things. She said she'd been thinking for a long time, and she wanted me to know she understood that she had handled things poorly over the years. She said she didn't have a good explanation for why she had let Ryan and Dana's dynamic set the tone for how the family related to me. She said she knew it wasn't fair. I stood there on the sidewalk and let her talk. The cold was getting through my coat. People walked past me and I watched them go. When she was done, I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She asked if we could have dinner. I said yes, I meant it. My dad called 2 days later. His call was shorter and less articulate, but he said essentially the same things. I told him I'd like to have dinner with him too. I meant that as well. My brother and I didn't talk for several more months. When we did, it was brief and careful, and neither of us said everything we might have said. He thanked me for giving him those names the day he came to my office. I told him I was glad he'd called them when he did. We talked about the weather for a moment, which was absurd, and then the call ended. It wasn't a repair. I don't know yet what it is. Some things take longer than a season to figure out. Dana called me once. It was a short call. She said she owed me an apology, and then she apologized, specifically for the Christmas exclusion. And then she said she knew there was more than that and she wasn't ready to have that conversation yet, but she wanted me to know she was aware of it. I told her I heard her. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it hadn't been. But I also didn't need her to carry it as a debt. I just needed her to see it. She did. That was something. Here is the thing I think about now, when I drive to my parents' house for dinner or sit across from my brother at the occasional Sunday lunch and we talk about ordinary things. I spent years adjusting myself to take up less space because the people I loved seemed more comfortable when I did. I made myself smaller and quieter and less present, and none of it changed how they saw me. Because you can't make yourself invisible enough to avoid being someone you actually are. What changed things wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a speech I prepared or a moment where I finally said what I should have said years ago. It was a Thursday afternoon in a lobby when my brother looked at my firm's name on the wall and understood, without my saying a word, that he had never bothered to find out who I was, and I had been there the whole time. I am not the problem I was told I was. I am not too serious or too distant or too much. I am a person who does serious work and tries to do it right. And I needed my family to see that, and eventually, in the most roundabout, exhausting way possible, they did. If you are the one in your family who was never quite right, who was too this or not enough that, who found out about gatherings after they happened and pretended it didn't land as hard as it did, I want you to know something. Don't shrink. Don't perform a smaller version of yourself to make the room more comfortable. Build your thing. Know your worth. And trust that the truth has a way of making itself known without you having to force it. You don't have to announce who you are to people who were never listening. You just have to keep being it. That's what I did. That's what I'm still doing. And I am no longer uninvited from anything.